On Chalfonte Avenue in Corktown, there's a historic Episcopalian church that was built using incredible woodwork throughout the building, which reflects the German heritage of the builders who lived in that area back in the day. Large exposed wooden beams hold up the ceiling in the pastor's office, and there are two giant fieldstone fireplaces that bookend the room. In the sanctuary of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, there are tall, clear windows towering high above the congregation. And at the front of the sanctuary is an elaborate stained glass window. Holding up the ceiling are giant wooden beams, and similar to the pastor's office, there are exposed beams along the ceiling. And when you first sit in the pews, everything looks complete. But upon closer examination of the walls and the wooden beams at the back of the sanctuary, there's just something a bit off. Whereas the wooden beams throughout the rest of the church are finished with smooth faces and edges, and the walls have painted plaster on them, the wooden beams in the sanctuary are coarse and unfinished, and the walls are absent of plaster, so the brick and mortar are visible. According to their pastor, Denise Griebler, who was giving the tour of the church, the congregation was in the process of building the sanctuary when the war began. This put a temporary hold on the project as materials became scarce and the workforce shifted its attention to concentrate on the war effort. Following the war, raw materials became available, and the congregation had the funds needed to resume the work on the sanctuary. However, the congregation saw a great financial need among their neighbors, so the church members voted to meet the needs of the community instead of finishing the work. She said many times throughout the history of their church, they've had generous donations to finish the project, yet every time a new need arose in the church and among their neighbors, so the donor or donors modified the intent of their gift to meet the new needs. Eventually, the congregation made the decision to leave the sanctuary as it was, incomplete. She says the congregation realized that the incomplete sanctuary serves as a symbol reflecting their spiritual journey. As a symbol, the incomplete sanctuary reminds us that no matter how much we want to be complete as Christians, we are constantly a work in progress. However, this idea that we are a work in progress is not meant to let us off the hook from trying to achieve perfection through completeness, as Paul encouraged the congregation to aim for. Rather, this idea that we are a work in progress reminds us that the Christian life is a constant building project, whereby we are constantly learning to build each other up, to be pure and blameless. Another way to view this is that we are always under construction. And in Philippians, Paul recognized that no one could ever be complete, nor achieve absolute perfection. After all, he admitted later that as much as he attempted to be perfect, he still experienced moments of failure. He acknowledged that he failed to be generous. He failed to see the needs around him. He failed to support those who were falling or needed support. And he neglected to be mindful of God's blueprints, will, and vision. Thus, by definition, he sinned against God and the community. To Paul, there are two types of sin: intentional sin and unintentional sin, or what John Wesley called sins of ignorance. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church, and he believed that sins of ignorance are always going to happen. Writing, we're always going to do the wrong thing from time to time because we don't know what the right thing is. We don't have perfect knowledge, but it's possible that by God's grace, a believer could mature to the point where they learn to listen to God and to the community. And though we are always achieving better, we also discover how to give selflessly. We want to learn how to achieve this because, he added, people come to a place where they are so in love with God that they would not sin knowingly. But as we've probably witnessed or even encountered, there are some people who fall short of God's glory, and even Paul admitted that he had shortcomings. Thus, we are all under construction, and none of us is complete. Paul insisted that instead of focusing on our shortcomings, though, and becoming discouraged, He encouraged the church to recall that God is ever patiently waiting for us to reach maturity as we build in faith. In addition, Paul reminded the congregation that God is involved in the process of bringing us to completion. This idea appeared in C.S. Lewis's work, Mere Christianity. He wrote that God is bringing us to perfection, not because it's a requirement that we must achieve in order for God to accept us. Instead, when we seek Christ's help in being the person God wants us to be, Jesus helps us to build correctly, aiming toward perfection. In an illustration, C.S. Lewis explained that when he was a child, he often had toothaches, and he knew that if he told his mother, then she'd make an appointment with their dentist the next day, and he didn't want that. Though he recognized the dentist would do their job and the pain would be removed and everything would be set right, he was fearful that after the dentist looked at the problematic tooth, the dentist would then look at his other teeth and see he had issues going on with those as well. And though he acknowledged that he needed his teeth set properly, he also didn't want to go through the ordeal. He likened Jesus to the dentist in this analogy, saying, if we ask for his help to deal with something about which we are ashamed, or which is spoiling our life, he will respond and will help us. But he won't stop there because he wants us to be perfect. Asking Jesus for assistance, he'll enter our lives and he'll uncover everything that mars our spiritual journey. Thus, we become vulnerable to his will when we ask him to help us. Because not only will he see our shortcomings, he might reveal additional ones we didn't know were there as well. To be certain, Jesus' purposes of revealing our shortcomings is not meant to punish or embarrass us. Rather, these revelations are intended to help us grow and increase in our spiritual maturity. In addition, our vulnerability reminds us that our spiritual lives are under construction, and thus they are not something to be done alone, because we share this spiritual building project with others as we support each other. For Paul, he viewed the members of the church fitting together to create such support. One way we could view this is that we are like a series of bricks built on each other to create a church building. Each stone is important because it supports the one beside it and above it. And thus, as a whole, we support the whole structure. As a building, there are times we'll deal with sinkings and settlings and unexpected movements of the world around us. There will be threats we encounter when the ground shakes or shifts beneath us, threatening to shake us loose or crack us and cause us to fall. When those times come, Paul recommended that the congregation recall their common faith in Jesus and to practice a type of love he called agape. Agape will hold us together in community. And agape is what God displayed to the world when Jesus was originally sent to be in our midst. Agape is the type of love that Paul spoke of when he wrote that love keeps no records of wrong, is not easily offended, and cherishes others without casting blame or finding faults, or perhaps cracks if we are sticking with the building metaphor. Agape also provides care to others as though we were caring for ourselves. And it involves putting our hearts and our souls into every act that we provide each other. But it's not agape alone that supports us and holds us together. It also takes faith in trusting that God is the master builder, who brings us together as living stones and helps us to stand strong no matter what. And it's God who guides us toward the project completeness. Agape helps us put our selfish desires and pride aside, so that by surrendering ourselves, we provide for the needs of others. That's the toughest part about being incomplete, because it's tough to discern how best to help or how best to avoid being selfish. Bishop Desmond Tutu pointed out that during times of personal discomfort, it's not easy to acknowledge another person's pain. Recognizing what others are going through might also be difficult, especially during this time of season, with our thoughts distracted by upcoming family gatherings, sharing gifts, and the busy schedule of events that we have planned. So we might not recognize someone else's need, or we might not know how to assist, or we might leave something incomplete. Yet Jesus points out that giving something is better than doing nothing, and that placing agape into practice is better than not trying to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Returning to Paul's instructions to the Philippi church, Paul praised them for their generosity and their love they gave him, and thankful, he encouraged them to do more, not for his own gain. Rather, he meant they ought to express the agape they had shown him to each other and to those outside the congregation, reaching far into the community. In his prayer, Paul used the same phrase Jesus used when he told his disciples they ought to love one another and to love their neighbors as they love themselves. Paul's prayer also highlighted how we reach perfection so that we are pure, blameless, and complete. First, we live life with humility, recognizing we ought to be generous and willing to listen to the needs of others. Second, we express agape to everyone around us, not withholding love, but rather seeing everyone around us as worthy of God's love. Third, we do the work of God, and we focus on the project at hand without being so firm that we're not willing to roll with the changes. And so that we, in this way then, continually seek personal and communal growth and not being stressed about the end goal of the project, whether it will end and what it will look like when it's over. Rather, we celebrate and we embrace Paul's prayer. So we begin God's good service and remain faithful and generous to the end. Finally, we are encouraged to remain faithfully committed to Jesus and to do the good work done among us, which will be brought to completion upon the return of Jesus. As we continue to build each other up and thus be built ourselves during the season of Advent and beyond, let us continue to practice agape and give generously to others until Jesus' next arrival. In this way, we build on our spiritual strengths so that one day we will be complete and we'll know how to listen to God and each other. We'll also be able to discern God's dreams and visions for our world. We will also discover, as we continue to grow spiritually, how to respond to the needs of the poor in our midst and in our community and those who live beyond our community. As we deepen our spiritual maturity, aiming toward perfection, we are encouraged to consider who can we share our gifts with and who God might be revealing to us today or this week that we ought to express active agape. Thus, we become complete.